Now we'll get the gun camera film. And I would like to make a confession, because the statute of limitations has run. If you are one of my children or grandchildren watching this, your grandfather was a thief. These films were made by cameras that were stored in the wings of the aircraft alongside the machine guns, the 50 caliber machine guns. And they went off whenever the trigger was pulled, or wherever a switch was put on to make them work. That is a Japanese Zero. And you can see that, well, did we get him? I'm not sure. Now these pictures, as I say, were made by the pilots on that famous mission to Don Muang Airfield. They were classified top secret, and they stayed in my vault until the end of the war. I inquired of higher headquarters whether they had to remain secret, and I talked to the right guy, and he said to me, "Ross, the war is over. Do with them whatever you please." Well, I don't know whether that entitled me to steal them, but I did stamp them declassified, and I signed my name on them, and I took them, and you have them. And this is really the history of the prime achievement of our whole organization during the whole war. We achieved surprise. We had a notable victory. We destroyed over 60 Japanese aircraft on the ground. Nobody was able to get off the ground in time before we arrived, and we destroyed a good part of the military section of the airfield. Now the story is interesting about that airfield, because remind yourself that we are in Thailand. Thailand was neutral in World War II. It was the area where they built the bridge on the River Kwai, if you ever saw that old movie. And the Japanese were very smart, and so were the Thailanders, who we call the Siamese at that time. They didn't put up a fight. They said, "Come in," to the Japanese. And the Japanese, in turn, treated them very well, because they didn't want anybody stabbing them in the rear. So they made a deal. Half the airfield remained civilian in the hands of the Thailanders, and half of it was military for the Japanese. In our liaison planes and other small planes, we used to ferry OSS operators, Office of Strategic Services agents. They were the precursors of our CIA. And one friend of mine from Quogue, Long Island, Petey Joost, was in the OSS. And I had to arrange for him to be ferried in to Don Muang Airfield. And we used to put them in at night into the civilian airfield. The Japs couldn't touch them. And in the morning, they simply disappeared into the civilian background and did their spy work. Now I'll get back to this business. Major Pryor, one of our top pilots. We had 2 fighter squadrons with 26 aircraft apiece. That's 52 airplanes in the air, all banging. All banging away at the Japanese at once. Well, it was a notable event, and the remarkable thing about it was that we didn't have a single casualty on that particular mission. In fact, when I debriefed the pilots after the mission, I asked them what problems they had, and they told me that the biggest problem they had was not being able to take a leak for 6 hours. Now, Captain Abrams' name just flashed up, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. It seems that as the war came to an end, the British had mounted a very important mission. They called it a triamphibious mission. It involved their army and it involved their Navy, and it involved their Air Force and our Air Force. And I was assigned in that particular mission to brief a bunch of troop carrier pilots, both our own people and British troop carriers, who were going to carry a bunch of Gurkhas, paratroopers, into the Rangoon Delta and dump them out so that they could attack presumed Japanese Army positions at the foot of the Delta, which were supposed to be able to keep the British Navy from approaching the city of Rangoon. Well, what happened was rather interesting. Colonel Chase, our executive officer, whom I mentioned earlier, had been forced down in a later mission, and he was in the Rangoon jail. We had intelligence to that effect. While I was briefing the pilots of these troop carrier squadrons, I received on a piece of paper a message in the clear from our rear base in India, which said as follows: "Sign in white stones observed on roof of Rangoon jail. Japs gone, dash Chase." I looked at it, I read it out aloud, since it was in the clear, to our assembled pilots, and I grinned at them and I said, "Well," I said, "there you are." I said, "Just don't have engine trouble and have a nice day." And I saw this look of horror on the face of the pilots in the front row, and I turned around and looked over my shoulder, and there was the entire brass of the English Southeast Asia Command, everybody. And they had faces like thunderclouds, and I'm sure if they could have killed me, they would. But the fact was that the mission was an abortion. The Japs had gone. Chase was correct. He was free by the time the British 12th Army got, 12th Corps, I'm sorry, got down to Rangoon. Now, what about Abrams? After the war was over, it didn't end immediately. It ended with the nuclear bombing of Japan. And when the Japanese finally gave up, we had the pleasant duty of flying in, because our troop carrier squadrons were the only ones available to do the job, flying into our old friendly Don Muang airfield and going to the prisoner of war camp nearby and liberating our prisoners. Not only ours, but some Dutch and some British and so forth. And it was quite an occasion. Colonel Fleming, the flight surgeon, and I, as the intelligence officer, were assigned to go in there. And when we got there, Colonel Fleming and I both had 45s on, rather heavy pistols, and I was down to about 90 pounds. And we looked out the window and saw all these Japanese lined up in rows of, in two rows, stretching from where the aircraft was to the hangar about 100 yards away. Must have been 2,000 men, all fully armed, with the officers standing at attention with their swords at present arms. And Fleming looked at me and he laughed. He says, "You know," he said, "I'm not going to carry this cannon around. If they want to shoot us, let them shoot." And so we went naked as the conquerors through this line of fully armed Japanese to take out our troops. Well, of course, they were delighted to see us, and they were all in very good shape. Nobody was starved or looking like the bridge on the River Kwai, and I guess the Japanese fed them up. And we had no trouble until we got to Captain Abrams. It turned out that Captain Abrams, who was an entrepreneur in civilian life, had started a PX in the PW camp, and he didn't want to leave. That is, he didn't want to leave until he got his record straight and got rid of his stock to the local Siamese. He was concerned because he would lose quite a lot of money if he did. So we told him that the war was over and Lord Louis Mountbatten was waiting for him in Calcutta, and he said, "Oh, shucks," and he got on the airplane with us. And in any event, when we got to Calcutta, the climax of the day was that when I got off the plane, I was so underweight, and from being overworked and lack of sleep and heat and so forth, that the newsmen looked at me and figured I had to be an example of a Japanese atrocity. They thought I was a prisoner of war, and they grabbed me. And it took me quite a while to convince them that I was not a POW who had been tortured by the Japanese, but the officer in charge of the rescue mission. And I guess probably with that story I ought to close, and so I will. And now we're going to have a sound movie of our family reunion in New York which I arranged in 1989 and which I hope all my children enjoyed. Good night, au revoir, and I wonder how many people are going to see this over how many years. I hope a lot. Good night.